There, welcome to Explain Apologetics. This week, we have a very special guest with us to discuss the undesigned coincidences in the New Testament. And of course, we won't be limiting the discussion merely to the New Testament. We'll hope to get to even the Old Testament as well, if time permits. So joining me today, a very special guest, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. He just completed his PhD in evolutionary biology. He is currently a teaching, I believe he's an assistant professor in a college in Boston. Pleasure to have you, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, and thank you for coming on Explain Apologetics.
It was great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Right, we've been, for those of you who are watching this and you think that the name Dr. Jonathan McLatchie sounds a little bit familiar, if you haven't quite heard his work, that's because a lot of plans were made to actually have Dr. Jonathan McLatchie in Malaysia in May. Which is, it was supposed to be next month, or was it during this time actually, in April to May? And there was a lot of excitement going on about that, but unfortunately, God had other plans with the COVID-19 and the lockdown situation in Malaysia. It's not been canceled. I understand from our team back in Malaysia. It's been postponed indefinitely. We're definitely hoping to have Dr. Jonathan McLatchie in Malaysia as well. But our focus today, our subject, is on the undesigned coincidences in the Bible. Maybe you could just begin, Dr. McLatchie, and just tell us what do you mean by undesigned coincidences?
Absolutely. So an undesigned coincidence is when you have two or more works by different authors that interlock in a way that is unlikely if the story is simply being made up, or if one source is copying from the other, or both are copying from a common source. So basically, it's interlocking in details in a way that points to the truth of the narrative.
Right. So if you could give an analogy of that, would that be like, if you're speaking to two eyewitnesses and their stories kind of collaborate?
Yeah, exactly. So a classic example of an undesigned coincidence would be when you have a natural question that's raised by one account, which is answered in passing in an incidental and non-deliberate way by the other account. So you have a natural question that's raised by one author, and then another author in an incidental and non-deliberate way answers that. That would be a classic form of an undesigned coincidence.
Right. So when we talk about the undesigned coincidences in the New Testament, what we're essentially looking for is by independent authorship, right? That's what we're looking for, where their stories kind of merge together. And I guess the big picture is, of course, to validate the reliability of the Bible throughout this. Is that a fair statement?
Right. So the importance of undesigned coincidences, as well as other patterns of evidence that bear on the reliability of the Gospels, is to build a cumulative argument for the substantial trustworthiness of the accounts that we find in our New Testament, or in the Bible more broadly. And in building a cumulative argument for the substantial trustworthiness of the Gospels and Acts, then that gives us grounds for thinking that the authors of those sources are close up to the facts, and that they have reliable access to information, and that they're habitually truthful in the reportage of that information. If we can show that the Gospels and Acts are substantially reliable, and that they are indeed close up to the facts and anchored in the testimony of credible and trustworthy eyewitnesses, then we have to take seriously what they say concerning the nature of the post-resurrection experiences of the disciples as coming from the early apostolic eyewitnesses. And that would include the resurrection experiences, polymodal nature, involving not multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, physical contact with Jesus. According to Acts 1, the resurrection encounters were extended across a 40-day time period, so it wasn't a brief confusing episode and so forth. So by showing that the Gospels and Acts are substantially reliable, that they go back to eyewitnesses or people who are very close up to the facts, then I think we can make a good argument that those claims pertaining to the nature and variety of the resurrection experiences of the apostles also goes back to very early sources.
Right. Right. So one of the interesting coincidences, not talking about the biblical coincidences, undesigned coincidences, but one of the coincidences between Dr. McLatchie and myself, of course, for those of you who don't know, Dr. McLatchie is an established Christian debater. He has been out there and debated some of the top skeptics and top Muslim apologists like Dr. Shabir Ali, Peter Atkins, Alex O'Connor, better known as Cosmic Skeptic. He's been out there, he's defended the faith, he's had the intellectual integrity to take the argument to the skeptics and present a reasonable case for the Gospels and for the Bible. One of the persons, and going back to the coincidence I was talking about, one of the persons that both of us have had the privilege of actually debating is an atheist by the name of Paulogia, Paul Ents, I think is his real name. We've had the privilege of debating him, Dr. McLatchie, on the resurrection of Jesus. And of course, if you debate Paulogia, what he will concede, I believe he would concede that that Jesus did die on the cross. He's willing to concede that, even though he's uncertain himself. But it seems to be when you get to the second and third facts that we typically use in the minimal facts argument, the facts that Jesus was placed into this tomb by the rich Jewish nobleman Joseph of Arimathea, and the fact that later that tomb was empty. Those are the two facts that really were challenged by Paulogia, especially during my debate with him. So, and his view is really that these things are like, it was mass hysteria that led the disciples to believe in what we would call the post-mortem appearances of Jesus and so forth. But if what you're saying is right, then it seems as if, we do have independent accounts that will kind of collaborate. And in that sense, you can kind of disprove that theory. And this idea of the undesigned coincidences in the New Testament come as a result of skeptics saying things like mass hysteria and that the gospel is basically due to legendary development decades later.
Absolutely. So let's perhaps go through a few examples of undesigned coincidences, just maybe to give your viewers a flavor of some of the arguments or some of the examples that we actually find in the Gospels. So if we could turn over to the Gospel of John in chapter number 6 and verse 5. This is the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And we read, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" And this immediately raises a question in the mind of the audience. Well, why does Jesus turn to Philip here on this occasion? Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Why not say turn to Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or someone like that? Surely he might be a more obvious choice. Well, why Philip here in particular? Well, if we go over 6 chapters later to a completely unrelated part of John's Gospel, different context, there's a different feast of Passover being celebrated, and there were some Jews at the feast who wanted to see Jesus. Some Greeks at the feast who wanted to see Jesus, verse 20. And in verse 21, so these came to Philip, and then we have this passing detail that John gives us, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and he asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." So Philip is from Bethsaida in Galilee, and we learned in John chapter 6, if you recall, that Jesus turns to Philip at the feeding of the 5,000 narrative, and we wonder, why does Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Well, if we go over to Luke's account, Luke also tells us about the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and this is in Luke chapter 9, and he says in verse 10, "On their return, the apostles told them all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida." And that's where the feeding of the 5,000 miracle takes place. So, and Luke, bear in mind, doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. It just mentions him speaking to the disciples. And John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story. And John 6 doesn't even mention that Bethsaida is Philip's hometown. You have to go and look at John 12, and it's also in John 1 to discover that. And so by putting the pieces together, we can build a coherent picture of why Jesus turns to Philip in John 6:5, because Philip's the local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread. But that's never spelled out in the text anywhere. You have to do the detective work of putting these puzzle pieces, if you will, together. And that's something that makes far more sense if these events are actually anchored in real history than if it's the product of fictionalization.
Right. So this was something that's happening before Jesus died. And going back to what I was saying about Paulogia, and the people that would say that, well maybe this we can account to the fact that these things did happen during Jesus's time. But what about after Jesus's time? Maybe towards after his resurrection. Do you have anything that would basically amount to an undesigned coincidences after that, or maybe towards the Book of Acts?
Sure, there's plenty in the Book of Acts as well. Here's an example from the Book of Acts. If we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul wrote his first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus in the early to mid 50s CE, and he has a couple of passing comments that are quite interesting. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, he says, "That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child of the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." So at the time Paul is writing his letter to the Corinthian Christians, he's already sent Timothy on his way to the church in Corinth. However, when we get over to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we read in verse 10, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord as I am." So that's interesting because because even though Timothy's already been sent on his way from Ephesus to Corinth by Paul, nonetheless Paul expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy arrives there in Corinth. Now, where is Corinth? Well, Corinth is the capital of Achaia, which we now know as Greece. And it's across the Aegean Sea from Ephesus. Ephesus is in Asia Minor, and Ephesus is where Paul is writing to the Corinthian Christians. So we would infer from these details in 1 Corinthians that presumably the most natural way to send a letter from Ephesus to Corinth would be by boat over the Aegean Sea. And Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia on his way around to Corinth. And so then that makes sense of how he's already sent Timothy on his way to Corinth and how he could nonetheless expect Timothy to arrive there, his letter to arrive there before Timothy got there. So if we turn over to the book of Acts, chapter 19, which is when Paul is in Ephesus, we go over to verse 21 and 22. It says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia," and Achaia is where Corinth is, by the way, "and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." And so Timothy and Erastus, indeed, we learn, go up the overland indirect route. 1 Corinthians doesn't even mention Erastus's part in traveling with Timothy, and Acts doesn't even mention Corinth as their destination. But nonetheless, these accounts in 1 Corinthians and Acts correlate with one another in a way that points to truth and shows that the author of Acts is close up to the facts, and it also supports the Pauline authorship of 1 Corinthians.
Right, this is really amazing. So are there any more examples in either the book of Acts or in the Pauline letters that, are there more examples like this that we find?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in the book of Acts, like if you limited the Pauline corpus just to Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, that's just the first four letters we find in the New Testament, I can already give you more than 40 examples of that sort of phenomenon. Okay. And that's not even including the other letters. I mean, there's tons in other epistles such as Colossians and so forth, Ephesians, 1 Thessalonians. But if I just limit myself to the first 4 letters of Paul that we find in the New Testament, I can already give you more than 40 examples. So another example, for instance, this one is from, if you look at this one relates to 1 Thessalonians. If we go over to the book of Acts in chapter 17, this is when Paul and Silas are in Thessalonica, and we're told that there's a Jewish mob that stirs up trouble against Paul and Silas in Thessalonica, and so they have to flee and go to Berea. And the Berean Christians, of course, you'll recall, are spoken of well because they didn't trust Paul, but went back and studied the scriptures to see if these things were so, and so they're commended for that. But the Jews from Thessalonica that stirred up trouble then come to Berea to also stir up the trouble there in Berea as well. And so Paul has to leave in haste, and he sets sail for Athens. And So it says, verse 13 of Acts 17, when Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating, stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So Paul leaves in haste for Athens, but he leaves Timothy behind in Berea. And then Timothy has instructions to then join Paul later. But we're not told of the reason why Paul and Timothy get separated. However, if we go over to the book of 1 Thessalonians, chapter number 2, if we look from verse 17, it says, but since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, this is chapter 3, therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you and our labor would be in vain. So under the circumstances, then Paul was concerned for the Christians at the church in Thessalonica. And so he leaves Timothy behind in Berea. That's the detail that's supplied by Acts. Timothy is left behind in Berea with instructions to go back to Thessalonica to check up on the Christians there to make sure that they're okay. And Timothy had instructions to then rejoin Paul later. But notice that 1 Thessalonians doesn't mention that Timothy was left behind in Berea, and Acts doesn't mention why Timothy is left behind in Berea either. It's only when you look at 1 Thessalonians that we learn, oh, I see, so he was left with instructions to go back to the church in Thessalonica. Berea, of course, is quite close to Thessalonica, so that makes sense. So you see again how that corroborates not only the veracity of the book of Acts, but also the authorship of 1 Thessalonians. So this can be used as a double argument. One side of the argument supports the substantial reliability of the book of Acts, and the other side of the argument supports the Pauline authorship of the letters that we find in the Pauline corpus.
Now, for those of you who are watching this, I really hope that this has actually whetted your appetite to just realize that how the Bible can come alive, and that the Scripture has a very self-authenticating nature, authenticating itself. In a while, we're definitely going to be going to extra biblical undesigned coincidences as well. But I do want to maybe ask Dr. McLatchie first, before that, if you could just maybe give us another one or two examples, because, we realize that we have an embarrassment of riches with regards to these undesigned coincidences. Just take us through maybe one or two more, and hopefully we'll get back to the Gospels and then the extra biblical sources.
Absolutely. Let's see. So let's take one further example from the book of Acts, and one further example from the Gospels. So this one is from, if we look at the book, okay, so in, you remember in Acts 16 when there's a, Acts 15. You remember in Acts 15 when there's a sharp falling out between Paul and Barnabas over Mark's previous withdrawal from Paul on a mission trip in Pamphylia. In verse 36, it says, after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now, Barnabas wanted to take with him John called Mark, and Paul thought best not to take with him one who was withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And so this raises a question in the mind of the audience. Why is Barnabas so keen for Mark to join with them? And why does it cause such a rift between Paul and Barnabas? After all, Mark had abandoned Paul on a mission trip in Pamphylia. Why is Barnabas so keen for Mark to go with them? If we go over to the book of Colossians and chapter number 4, we learn when we look at verse 10, it says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So now we learn that there's actually a familiar relation between Barnabas and Mark, which we weren't told by the book of Acts. And Colossians shows no knowledge, or it doesn't provide any information of the fact that there was ever a rift between Paul and Mark, between Paul and Barnabas over this. It seems that by the point of Paul's first Roman imprisonment, when he was writing Colossians, this rift between Paul and Barnabas over Mark had been resolved. And so it's not that the author of Colossians is trying to insert this detail to then explain the book of Acts, because there's no mention of this rift, this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas over Mark in Colossians. However, in the book of Acts, we have this question as to why there was this, why Barnabas wanted to be joined by Mark, which is answered in passing by Paul in Colossians chapter 4, that there was this familiar relation, even though these connections are undesigned, which is why we call them an undesigned coincidence. So then that supports the authorship of Colossians, which is one of the disputed letters of Paul. There's scholars are widely split as to whether Paul was the author of Colossians or not. This is one of many lines of evidence which I think supports the authorship of Colossians. And one thing that scholars are pretty much unanimous on, by the way, is that Colossians and Ephesians were written by the same author. So any evidence that supports the authorship of Colossians also in turn supports the authorship of Ephesians. Let's take one more example from the Gospels. If we go over to the Gospel of John in chapter 12, we read an extraneous detail that's specific to John that we don't find in any other Gospel's account. And that is in verse 1, it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Now, although all four Gospels mention the coming to Bethany and the triumphal entry that follows, only John uniquely gives us that detail that Jesus approached Bethany 6 days before Passover. And in verse 12 says, the next day, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. So Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem then is 5 days prior to Passover. That's a detail that only John uniquely gives us. If we can confirm that that detail is in fact genuine, then it's a very specific detail for John to get right, and indeed suggests that he is indeed close up to the facts concerning these matters. If we go over to the Gospel of Mark, Mark also tells us about the triumphal entry. And he says, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied to which no one has ever sat, untie to bring it. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately. So Mark seems to telescope the narrative somewhat. He doesn't mention that Jesus actually approached Bethany the night before, and it wasn't until the morning that he sent the disciples to get the colt. He doesn't give us that particular detail. He telescopes it and doesn't give us the detail that actually the arrival of Bethany was the night before entering Jerusalem. But let's assume, for the sake of argument here, that John is actually correct, that Jesus indeed entered Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. Well, if we look at verse 11, it says, he entered Jerusalem and went to the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So that would be the evening of 5 days before Passover, if John is correct. Now, verse 12 says, on the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. That would make it the morning of 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. When we go down to verse 19, it says, when evening came, they went out of the city. That would make it the evening of 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its fruits. That would make it the morning of 3 days before Passover, if John is correct. In chapter 13, you have the so-called Olivet Discourse, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So I think we can fairly say that this is his way home for the evening. And so this is the evening of 3 days before Passover. Chapter 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover. And so it synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the chronology provided to us by John's Gospel. And this is in a very undesigned and casual way, which I think points to the veracity of these accounts.
Right. So apart, and I meant to go back to the Gospels as well, because we only had one or two, apart from the one that you just brought up. Apart from these two, which is the one we saw in Jesus feeding of the 5,000, asking Philip from Bethsaida, where do you find bread to feed these people? What are one or two of your most favorite ones? And if you could tell us why, especially though you particularly like them.
Yeah, that one I just gave is one of my favorite in the Gospels, for the reason that it's so casual, and you can literally count off the days in Mark based upon the chronology of John, and you end up at such a neat correlation or synchrony between John and Mark. I'll give one other example, and that's to do with the Last Supper, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. If we look at Luke's version of the account, in Luke 22, we read in verse 27, this is at the Last Supper. He says, Jesus says, for who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? It's not the one who reclines at table, but I'm among you as the one who serves. Now, the question is, what does Jesus mean by that phrase, and to what could he be referring? Well, when we go over to John 13, verses 4 and 5, we learn that Jesus, at the same event, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. And now only John records the event that makes sense of Jesus' statement in Luke, I'm among you as one who serves. But then the question arises, okay, so why does Jesus wash their feet in John's Gospel? Well, John's Gospel is the only Gospel which mentions the washing of the disciples' feet. Well, if you look for Luke's Gospel, the parallel account, Luke 22, verse 24, it mentions that a dispute also arose among them, that's among the disciples, as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. So only Luke mentions the dispute that explains why Jesus gave them this object lesson in servanthood, an object lesson of which we only learn when we read John's Gospel. But John's Gospel doesn't mention the dispute among the disciples as to who is the greatest. And so again, you've got this correlation or harmonization between the Gospels in a way that, or an interlocking between the Gospel accounts that points to the truth of the narratives. One other example I'll give in the Gospels is has to do with the listing of the 12 disciples. So this is if we look at in Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, it says, the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. So here we see that the gospel narrative curiously groups the disciple names into pairs. Why does he group them into pairs like this? Well, if we go over to Mark chapter 6 and verse 7, we find the answer. Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. So only Mark has this detail. But Mark 3, verses 16 through 19, which lists the disciples, does not group them into pairs. And so again, you've got this intersection between the gospel accounts in a way that points to truth. Another great example is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 58, when Jesus is at his interrogation before Caiaphas, and the false witnesses step forward saying, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. And then later when he's on the cross in Mark 15:29, it says, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, nothing in the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, provides a pretext for this accusation. And the audience is kind of left hanging as to what did Jesus actually say. It's a pretty serious allegation to say that someone is going to, or someone claimed that they were going to destroy the temple. It's not, in first century Judea, it's not the sort of thing that you make jokes about. It's an unexplained illusion, which in itself actually points to the veracity of the statement. But when we go over to the Gospel of John, in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, we read the following. This is just after Jesus has cleansed the temple towards the beginning of his ministry. It says, so the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, it turns out that the temple he's speaking of is his body. But John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not as used as an accusation. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark, which contain that later misrepresentation, give us the accusation that came later, the twisting of Jesus' words, but not the original statement. So neither of these is copied from the other. And so you've got an interlocking between Mark and John that in a way that points to the truth of that statement. And so I think that's quite when you have so many different examples of these undesigned coincidences together with other patterns of evidence that bear on the reliability of the gospel accounts, I think we have a very strong grounding for thinking that indeed the gospels are based on substantially reliable eyewitness testimony.
Absolutely. I mean, and I one of my two favorite examples that you just cited there, and one of them has to do with the washing of the feet. And we've known that the Gospel of John talks about the washing of the feet, and you know why that Jesus basically goes down and does that. But now you actually realize the context for that is actually provided in the Synoptics, where you know the disciples are disputing who is going to be the greatest. Jesus demonstrates what greatness is by his servant leadership, getting on his knees and start to wash the feet of the disciples. That's quite amazing when you think about it. And the other one, I guess, from a theological standpoint, and I guess it's really mind-blowing, is the statement that comes in, I believe you mentioned in John chapter 2, which is where Jesus says, you know, that destroy this temple and in 3 days I'm going to build it again. You find that accusation in the cross, and you kind of think like this almost makes Jesus sound like someone who is just speaking rashly and recklessly about the destruction of the temple, bearing in mind, of course, that the temple was going to be destroyed later in AD 70. But I guess there's a theological theme as well going on there, particularly if you look at Ezekiel, when the Spirit of God departs from the temple. The temple is gone. God is no more dwelling in the temple, and this great desire from the Jews to want to come back to for God to come back to the temple. And then you find in Malachi this prophecy saying that the Lord himself will return to his temple. And before that great day comes, you're going to find a forerunner coming, you know, announcing, preparing the way for the Lord. And you find that in John chapter 1, the forerunner is John the Baptist. He himself claims to be that forerunner. And in John chapter 2, Jesus goes to the temple, except that when he is in the temple, he refers to his body as the temple, implying, of course, that the meeting place between God and man is not just in a physical location, it's in the body of Christ. So you've got theological depth to that analogy, and you've also got the historical corroboration that you see that these things kind of gel together. It's really amazing stuff, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. So I want to also look at the Old Testament, or would you want to go to the extra biblical ones first? I'll leave that entirely up to you.
Here, let's go through some extra biblical coincidences while we're in the New Testament, I think. So let's take an example that we just covered. So in John chapter 2, when the Jews say, what miraculous sign do you show to prove your authority to do this? In John chapter 2, and Jesus replies in verse 19, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. And we talked about already how you've got this coincidence with Mark and also Matthew that points to the veracity of that saying, because the Synoptic Gospels report the garbled version, but not the original statement, and John reports the original statement, thus illuminating what's going on in Matthew and Mark. Now, what happens next in that account? In verse 20, the Jews respond, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it in 3 days? Now, when did the Jews begin construction on the temple? Well, this is the second temple that they're talking about, and Herod himself had the temple rebuilt, even though it's still called the second temple. But Herod himself had the temple rebuilt, beginning. Josephus tells us that it was in the 18th year of his reign, which falls in around 19 BC. So 46 years on from 19 BC lands you in 28 AD. Bear in mind that there's no AD 0. So we land in 28 AD as 46 years from the commencement of the temple reconstruction by Herod. Now, according to Luke chapter 3, when did Jesus begin his public ministry? Well, the year that he was baptized was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So when did Tiberius Caesar become emperor? Well, according to Suetonius, who was a Roman historian, 2 years prior to the death of Augustus, in order to ensure the smooth transition of power, Augustus made Tiberius co-emperor. So that was in 12 AD. And 15 years on from 12 AD is the year in which Jesus began his public ministry. And that would land you in 27 AD. And the events that we read about in John 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple and the Jews challenge him, occurs the following Passover after the commencement of his public ministry, after his baptism, the following Passover, which lands you in 28 AD. And so you've got two independent ways there of corroborating the dates supplied to us in Luke and in John. So there we've used John, we've used Luke, we've used Suetonius, we've used Josephus in one big undesigned coincidence. And so it again points to the veracity of that episode.
That is really mind-blowing, right? The amount of, it's quite mind-blowing when you actually think about that. And amazing stuff. Is there any other analogies you would like to give from the extra biblical sources, or do you want to go to the Old Testament?
Sure, let's take another one.
Sure.
So I mentioned earlier that in the number of undesigned coincidences in relation to Acts and the epistles of Paul, if you only gave me Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, I could already give more than 40 examples. With extra biblical undesigned coincidences or corroborations, I can give you more than 100 in the book of Acts alone.
Okay.
Right? So let me give you an example from the book of Acts. This is in Acts 23. This is when Paul is at his trial, or rather, so Paul has been apprehended and he's been brought before the Jewish council. And he's standing before, he's standing before the high priest Ananias. And it says, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So how come Paul didn't know who the high priest was, right? Okay. Surely he could tell by his garb or something, right? Well, it turns out, if you read Josephus, that actually Ananias was not the high priest, but he was acting in judgment in that assumed capacity. He had previously held the office, he'd been deposed, the person who'd replaced him, called Jonathan, had been murdered, another had not yet been appointed to the station, and so during the vacancy of his own authority, he assumed upon himself the discharge of the office. And so then that illuminates Paul's words. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest, right?
Oh, that's really amazing. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe one more from the Gospels. We go over to the Gospel of Matthew in chapter number 2. This is when when Joseph and Jesus and Mary have to flee to Egypt. And it says that in verse 19, when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose, took the child and mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. So Herod the Great, Josephus tells us that when Herod the Great died, which was around 4 BC, most scholars think he died around 4 BC, then his territory was divided among his sons, with Herod Antipas becoming the ruler in Galilee, and Herod Archelaus becoming the ruler in Judea. And in the knowledge of Herod the Great's passing, he's on his way back to Judea, and of course it might have been a wise presumption that his son Archelaus might be reigning now that Herod the Great has passed away. But then he suddenly learns that Herod Archelaus is now reigning in place of his father Herod, and so now he's very afraid to go there. And so it raises the question in the mind of the audience, well, why is he so afraid of Archelaus? This is the only time that Archelaus ever gets a mention in Scripture. Well, Josephus tells us that Archelaus had acquired quite a bloody reputation. And actually, one of the last things that Herod the Great did before his death was to have certain Jews executed brutally for their part in having removed shields from the Jewish temple, which contained engraven images. The Jews have a tendency to get quite upset with the violation of the Second Commandment. So some of the Jews took it upon themselves to have these shields removed, and Herod the Great found out who was responsible and had them executed. And then Herod the Great passed away, and Herod Archelaus took power, and the Jewish Passover festival rolled around, and there was this influx of Jewish pilgrims coming in for the Passover, and an argument was struck up between a Jewish mob and a group of Roman soldiers over what happened. And the Jewish mob picked up stones and they stoned the Roman soldiers, and some of them died. And then Josephus tells us that the Jews then picked up their sacrifices for the Passover and ran as fast as they could into the Jewish temple. And Herod Archelaus was enraged at this threat upon his government. So he rounded up his entire army, and he marched towards the Jewish temple. He surrounded the cavalry. He surrounded the temple with the cavalry and told them, "Do not let anyone leave or enter the temple." And then he sent the foot soldiers into the temple and told them, "Kill everyone you find." And so they killed 3,000 Jews that day. And then he announced, "Passover is cancelled. Return to your homes." And so you can imagine Joseph on his way back to Judea, encountering this massive fleeing pilgrims coming out of Judea, hearing what just happened and thinking, maybe it's best to avoid going to Judea right now. And so he changes his itinerary and goes to Galilee instead, where his younger brother Herod Antipas is reigning instead of Archelaus. And so again, you've got this extra biblical information, which then provides further illumination on that. Do you want more New Testament examples, or do you want to move to the Old Testament?
No, I want to leave it entirely to you, because this is really nuggets of gold that we're getting here from just looking at this. We're going to talk about at the end about which books that people can look at. Particularly going to be mentioning Dr. Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain Sight. We'll bring that up later. But I'll leave that entirely up to you if you want to bring one or two more and before you go to the Old Testament.
Sure. Let's take another one from the New Testament. Let's go continue in the Gospels just now. Let's look at the book of Acts. 8. This is when Jesus is giving teaching on divorce and remarriage. And okay, so Mark chapter 10, verse 1 through 12 says, "He left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again and again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' He answered them, 'What did Moses command you?' They said, 'Moses allowed a wife to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away.' And Mark said to them, 'The cause of your heart your hardness of your heart, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And then look at verse 10 through 12. It says, and in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And this presents a problem, because Jewish law made no provision for a man to divorce, for a woman to divorce her husband. It only made provision for a man to initiate divorce proceedings against his wife. Now, this has led to an objection that perhaps here Mark is actually a Gentile who's betraying his ignorance of Jewish law, or perhaps he's deliberately fudging Jesus' teachings to make it more suitable for our Roman audience, where women can initiate divorce proceedings. Well, Josephus tells us that Herodias, who was previously married to Herod Antipas's brother called Philip, Josephus tells us that Herodias took it upon herself to confound the laws of her country, to divorce her first husband in order to marry Herod Antipas. Now, where was Herod Antipas tetrarch? He was tetrarch of Galilee, the very place where Jesus gave this teaching. And so again, it makes perfect sense of why the disciples take him aside to ask him again about this matter, and why he says, whoever divorces his wife marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband marries another, she commits adultery. And so it's perfectly appropriate and fitting for the time and setting and historical context of that particular episode. Relating to that, we can look at the martyrdom account of John the Baptist in Mark chapter 6. So when Herodias divorced Philip in order to marry Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas also divorced his wife in order to marry Herodias. And unfortunately, Herod's ex-wife was daughter of Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. And so she went crying home to her father, and this caused a war between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. In Mark chapter 6, we read about the martyrdom of John the Baptist, and we're told that the executioner, the word in the Greek that's used for the executioner is actually the word speculatura, which literally is a military officer or a scout, literally. Why does Herod not use a civil executioner? Why use a military officer to carry out the execution of John the Baptist? Well, Josephus tells us that Josephus actually also contains an account of the martyrdom of John the Baptist, and he tells us that actually that Herod was not at his palace in Galilee at the time, but rather was on a military campaign, and he was at his military fortress that he had constructed called Machaerus on the north corner of the Dead Sea. So then that illuminates why there's a military officer carrying out the execution in Mark 6, even though that particular information is not supplied to us by Mark. Furthermore, Herod actually lost that war against his former father-in-law Aretas IV, and the people blamed his loss, his failure, on the way he had treated John the Baptist, which is curious because the Gospels tell us the reason Herod didn't like John the Baptist was because John the Baptist kept complaining about his adulterous relationship with Herodias. Right. And finally, the final point I'll make on that is if you go to the Gospel of Luke chapter 3, we read about John the Baptist baptizing in the Jordan. And it says the crowds asked him, verse 10, the crowds asked him, what then shall we do? And he answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. Tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, teacher, what shall we do? And he said to them, collect no more than you are authorized to do. Soldiers also asked him, what shall we do? And he said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages. Now, notice in verse 14, it says, soldiers also asked him. Now, in the Greek, is actually an active participle. Literally, it's those being soldiers, or those soldiering is the most literal translation of that expression. So, these are soldiers on active duty at a time when there's only one single military conflict going on at this time, and that's the conflict between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. So, Josephus tells us that Herod had built this military fortress called Machaerus at the north shore of the Dead Sea. And of course, the Jordan River, where John the Baptist is baptizing, flows north and south into the Dead Sea. So these soldiers are on their way to show up the military garrison at Machaerus, and their path together is directly on the path where John the Baptist is baptizing. So again, you've got another undesigned coincidence with external secular sources which corroborate the biblical accounts.
That is, again, you've just so many examples just to show us that we're not short of examples where the Bible self-authenticates. Now, we do want to get to the Old Testament, and due to time, maybe we could just go to about two examples and pick your two favorite Old Testament examples on these undesigned coincidences.
Absolutely. So if we go to the book of 2 Samuel in chapter 15, we read about the conspiracy against King David, and in particular Absalom, who is one of David's sons, who led a coup against King David. And in verse 12 says, this is 2 Samuel 15, verse 12, it says, while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city Giloh. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. So just this incidental passing detail that during the conspiracy, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor. Now, who was Ahithophel? Well, according to 2 Samuel 16, verse 23, it says, now in those days, the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. So Ahithophel then was David's most trusted counselor. So trusted, in fact, that when he consulted Ahithophel's wisdom, his counsel, it was as though he was consulting the word of God. That's how much Ahithophel's advice meant to King David. So the question then arises, why does Ahithophel become so hostile? Well, to find the answer to that question, we can turn over to chapter 23, some 8 chapters later, after chapter 15. A completely different context, where there's a mention of 37 bodyguards of King David. Just a list of names that probably, if you've read 2 Samuel, you just skip past it and not bother to actually read through that big list of names. However, there are 2 individuals in particular that stand out. One is, in verse 33, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. And the other in verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. So Uriah the Hittite and Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, are colleagues. Now, Uriah the Hittite might start to ring a bell as the father of, rather the husband of Bathsheba, the one whom David had put to death in order to cover up his adulterous affair that he had with Bathsheba. We learn that from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. It says, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So now we begin to understand why Uriah ended up married to Bathsheba, because he's a colleague of her father in the military, in David's in service as one of David's bodyguards. So they're colleagues, and so evidently Bathsheba had been introduced to Uriah by her father Eliam, who was one of his co-workers. Now, and it also begins to illuminate for us why Ahithophel was so quick to turn on King David, because Ahithophel is the father of Eliam, and Eliam is the father of Bathsheba. And so Ahithophel then is the grandfather of Bathsheba. And so then that illuminates why Ahithophel is so quick to turn on King David, even though that's never spelled out anywhere for us in the text. In fact, where it gets even more interesting is when we turn over to 2 Samuel 16, and we learn about Ahithophel's counsel to Absalom. 2 Samuel 16, verse 20 to 22. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your counsel, what shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof. And Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Why pick the roof as the location to pitch the tent on which to go into his father's concubines? Because that's where David's lustful eye first caught Bathsheba bathing. And so that's never spelled out anywhere for us in the text. You have to do the detective work. And these names of Eliam and Uriah are buried in that list of 37 bodyguards that we find in 2 Samuel 23. And 2 Samuel 11, which mentions the identity of Bathsheba, doesn't mention that Eliam, her father, was actually the son of Ahithophel. You only find that in that incidental mention in that list of bodyguards in 2 Samuel 23. So by putting the pieces together and playing the detective, we can show that actually there's that this seems to be grounded in historical reality. That seems to be the best explanation of that information.
Now that seems really interesting, because now you paint the motive as well, why Ahithophel would actually want Absalom to actually sleep with his father's wives in public, almost like a revenge, right? To kind of take to avenge what David did to Eliam and all that. So Eliam to Uriah rather. So you just see that even though it's not mentioned, these kind of things do fit together in an amazing way. Let's go for one more example. And then we'll try and tie this to a close as to how those of you who are watching at home, can apply this, especially in discussion to non-Christians. So yeah, let's go for one more. And if you do have time, we can go to another one as well.
Sure. Here's another one from the Old Testament. So this one is in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 12 and 13. It speaks about Hezekiah. It says, at that time, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of Hezekiah's illness. So Hezekiah had become ill during his war during the siege of where the Assyrians had besieged Judah, and Hezekiah was king of Judah. And during that time, Hezekiah fell critically ill, but he recovered. So these are envoys that have been sent bearing gifts because of they had heard of Hezekiah's illness. And Hezekiah received the envoys and showed them all that was in his storehouses: the silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine olive oil, his armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. Now, wait a minute. Let's go over to 2 Kings chapter 18. So this is 2 chapters earlier. This is 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13 through 16. It says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, had asked for a bribe in order to stave off his siege of Judah. And Hezekiah was reduced to emptying the treasury and even stripping the gold from the temple doorposts in order to make this tribute payment to Sennacherib. And of course, Sennacherib accepted the bribe, saying thank you kindly, but then continued with the siege anyway. So he basically betrayed Judah, and Isaiah 33 actually describes the Assyrians as traitors for what they'd done. So then this question arises, okay, so how is it then that 2 chapters later in 2 Kings 20, when these envoys arrive to see Hezekiah following his recovery from his illness, Hezekiah decides to give them a tour of the royal treasury? What royal treasury? He just emptied it. Right. Well, when you go over to 2 Chronicles contains the account of the destruction of Sennacherib's army by the miraculous intervention of the angel of the Lord, which is also found in Isaiah and 2 Kings, albeit in different wording and terminology from the account in 2 Chronicles. And after these events, 2 Chronicles throws in a unique detail in chapter 32 and verse 23. It says, and many brought gifts to the Lord to Jerusalem, and precious things to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of all nations from that time onward. And so following his victory, because of course the angel of the Lord came and destroyed the Assyrian army, the nations around him brought him congratulatory gifts. And this explains how Hezekiah came to have a full treasury to show off to the Babylonian envoys by the time the Babylonians learned of his recovery. No mention is made of the humiliating tribute to the Assyrians in 2 Chronicles, but Second Kings does mention the humiliating tribute and him showing off his treasury shortly thereafter to the Babylonian envoys, but makes no mention of the gifts that replenished the treasury. Isaiah makes no mention of the tribute or the gifts biblical narrative.
Right, I think we have we just lost the last line that you said there due to the poor connection. If you could just repeat your last sentence again.
Yeah. So Isaiah. No mention is made of the humiliating tribute to the Assyrians in 2 Chronicles. 2 Kings mentions the humiliating tribute and him showing off his treasury shortly thereafter to the Babylonian envoys, but makes no mention of the gifts that replenish the treasury. And Isaiah makes no mention of the tribute or the gifts, but does mention his display of his great wealth. And so there again, we have these interlocking details which corroborate and confirm the historical grounding of that account.
Oh, thank you for that. This has been an eye-opener, and it's just, I can imagine that those of you who are watching this at home, that you've been thoroughly blessed by just seeing this. Now, I do want to just point you to a couple of resources before we leave that you can basically go to get more of this, because Dr. Jonathan McLatchie is the founder of Apologetics Academy, and I believe there's a lot of webinars that go on. Is it your channel or is that on your website, Dr. McLatchie?
Yeah, I live stream them to my YouTube channel, Apologetics Academy, and I also run them on Zoom, so people can submit questions and tune in. And I run those periodically, usually on Saturdays. So apologetics-academy.org is the website. You can find the schedule for that.
Right. So we'll put the link to that in the description box, so that those of you who want to follow the work of Dr. Jonathan McLatchie or to subscribe to his channel, you can do that as well in the link, and I'll highly recommend it. As you can see, the quality of the work he's putting out, it's not just the same old arguments again. It's taking a fresh look at the Gospels and basically seeing the authenticating factors that surround it. Now, one last thing is that I do want to highly recommend as well Dr. Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain Sight. Maybe you want to tell us briefly about that book, Dr. McLatchie.
Sure. It's actually called Hidden in Plain View.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
You can find that on Amazon.com. It's available for Kindle as well as hard copy, and it's an excellent book. It covers many examples of undesigned coincidences between and within the gospel accounts, and also between Acts and the epistles of Paul. It does not cover undesigned coincidences that occur between the Pauline letters, but that don't intersect with Acts. There are actually quite a number of those as well, which are quite interesting, because although they don't necessarily support the book of Acts per se, they do support the Pauline authorship of the letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. So Lydia doesn't cover those examples. So she doesn't cover the extra biblical undesigned coincidences, which I've covered, some of which I've covered today. But she limits her analysis to examples between and within the gospel accounts and between Acts and the letters of Paul. And it's not an exhaustive treatment either. There's plenty other ones she doesn't cover as well. So it's a great introduction, I think, to the topic of undesigned coincidences and how they support and provide evidence for the reliability of the biblical accounts.
Right. So if they want to follow more of your work in terms of undesigned coincidences, have you done some written work on this that they could follow, some videos that they could go to?
I have. If you go to my YouTube channel, Jonathan McLatchie on YouTube, I've got some video lectures there where I cover this material, and I also have debates where I get into it. I did a debate, for instance, a couple years ago in South Africa with Yusuf Ismail, who's an Islamic apologist, on Are the Gospels Based on Eyewitness Testimony, where undesigned coincidences was a core component of my argumentation there. and that's on my YouTube channel. I also have a 6-part article series I wrote recently, which is available at answeringmuslims.com, where I engage very thoroughly with critiques of the argument from undesigned coincidences by Richard Carrier, who is an atheist and mythicist scholar who is one of the fringe crowd who think that Jesus never actually existed as an historical person, which is a completely indefensible position. But he wrote an article recently, quite a lengthy article, critiquing the argument from undesigned coincidences, and I give a very extensive critique there at answeringmuslims.com in 6 parts, and find his objections quite wanting, to be honest. So yeah.
Well, that would be great to see a debate between you and Richard Carrier. I believe that William Lane Craig completely blew him out of the water in the last debate that they had. Any plans to do that debate on Jesus mythicists anytime soon?
Yeah, I actually have debated Richard Carrier. That's also available on my YouTube channel. It was on Premier Christian Radio 2 or 3 years ago. So you can access that at my YouTube channel. It was on did Paul believe in a celestial Jesus? That was the topic of the debate. So I recommend that.
So we'll put all of this descriptions, all of this that we've just mentioned just now, we'll put all of that in the description boxes, the description section below this video. And if you haven't quite subscribed to our channel, Explain Apologetics, you can do that as well. Once again, no compulsion, just a friendly suggestion. Again, I do encourage you to follow Dr. Jonathan McLatchie's work that he's done. He's produced a lot of work out there. You can follow his debates as well. We'll definitely really hope to get Dr. Jonathan McLatchie back on this channel again, particularly to talk about debate experiences and how you can debate non-Christians. We'll try and arrange that at some later date. But beyond anything else, we'll also keep you, for those of you who are watching in Malaysia, we'll keep you posted on when we can get Dr. Jonathan McLatchie down in Kuala Lumpur and also some other parts of Malaysia as well. It's been a thorough pleasure being with you, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, just dropping down nuggets of information as to how the gospel self-authenticates. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Indeed, it's been a pleasure here as well. So once again, this is wraps up our session here. We hope in this period of the lockdown in Malaysia, the MCO movement control order in Malaysia, we have more interviews like this to provide quality content so that you will be edified in the faith. But remember that all this is not just for your head as well. We hope that you'll be able to use this to better share the gospel to those around you. That's the best way to apply all of this. Until then, I'm Samuel Nesan, and on behalf of Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, thank you for watching this. Bye for now.